At 9:25 on Tuesday, the 15th of February, 1944, Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, stood on the ground below Monte Cassino and watched his bombers come in. There were 142 B-17 Flying Fortresses, followed by 47 B-25 Mitchells and 40 B-26 Marauders. Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers stood with him. Days earlier, Eaker had flown over the abbey himself and reported what he had seen inside its walls. A radio mast, German uniforms hanging on a line in the courtyard, and machine gun emplacements some 50 yards from the masonry. He believed the abbey was the reason the Allied advance had stopped. He believed that a sufficient weight of bombs would remove it. He believed that when the bombing ended, infantry would be able to walk up the mountain and take the ground. By that evening, the abbey had been reduced to rubble. Approximately 230 Italian civilians who had taken shelter inside were killed. No evidence was ever found that a single German soldier died in the building. The belief that sent those aircraft over the mountain would take 3 more months and tens of thousands of casualties to kill. The belief did not begin at Cassino. It did not begin with Eaker either. It had been handed to him. Between the wars, the argument had been made by the Italian theorist Giulio Douhet and by the British airman Hugh Trenchard, among others, that air forces could decide campaigns on their own, and that armies would follow behind to occupy what the bombing had already settled. It was a serious argument made by serious men, and it was still unproven in 1944. It also carried a weight that had nothing to do with any particular mountain in Italy. The United States Army Air Forces were a branch of the Army. Their commanders wanted a service of their own. That required proof on the record that bombing produced results ground troops could not produce at any price. Eaker needed that proof. So did General Karl Spaatz. And 8 months before the Abbey, they had been given it. Pantelleria is a volcanic island in the Narrows between Tunisia and Sicily. In the spring of 1943, ahead of the invasion of Sicily, the Allies decided to find out whether a fortified island could be taken by bombardment alone. The operation was called Corkscrew. Between the 8th of May and the 11th of June, 1943, Allied aircraft flew 5,285 sorties against Pantelleria and dropped approximately 6,200 tons of bombs. The garrison numbered 11,121 Italians and 78 Germans. On the morning of the 11th of June, the landing force came in toward the beaches. Before the infantry reached the shore, the garrison surrendered. Afterwards, Eisenhower recorded that he had ordered the operation against a good deal of contrary advice, and that the outcome had been the one he expected. "I predicted that the garrison would surrender before any infantry soldier got ashore," he wrote. Spaatz drew a wider conclusion from it. The air power available to the Allies, he claimed, could reduce to the point of surrender any first-class nation. That was the proof. More than 11,000 men had held a fortified island with pillboxes and gun batteries, and the bombers had taken it without a battle for the ground. There was one detail in the record that did not fit, and it came from the Allied analysis of their own success. The post-operation assessment concluded that the decisive factor at Pantelleria had not been the tonnage. It had been the morale of the garrison. The same assessment observed that it would have been close to impossible to compel the surrender of a determined enemy, dug in behind hardened and buried works, by air attack alone. Captured German technicians on the island put it more plainly. German troops, they said, would have made a better showing. The anomaly was recorded, and it was set aside. Pantelleria had been an Italian garrison, isolated, short of water at the end of a lost campaign in Africa. The conclusion drawn was not that bombing could not break determined men. The conclusion drawn was that these particular men had not been determined. By the middle of February 1944, the Allied position in front of Cassino was not the position of an army about to prove anything. The Gustav Line ran across the width of Italy, and its hinge was the high ground above the town of Cassino, with the Abbey on the summit and the Rapido and Gari rivers in front of it. On the night of the 20th of January, the United States 36th Infantry Division, under Major General Fred L. Walker, had put 2 regiments across the Gari below the town. No armor got over with them. Inside 48 hours, the division lost approximately 2,100 men killed, wounded, and missing, and the crossing was given up. In the mountains to the north, the 34th Infantry Division had fought to within a few hundred yards of the Abbey walls and could get no further. By the 11th of February, the American divisions were spent and were being relieved. To the German command, the arithmetic looked settled. The 14th Panzer Corps under General Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin held prepared positions in the mountains. The Allies had to come uphill across flooded ground into observed fire in winter with formations that had been in action for months. On paper, the line could be held. On paper, it had been held twice already. What the Allied assessment missed was not on paper at all. General Lieutenant Richard Heydrich commanded the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. He was 47, born at Lawalda in Saxony on July 28, 1896, and he had fought on Crete in 1941, where the island had been defended by Lieutenant General Sir Bernard Freyberg. Freyberg had lost Crete. In February 1944, Freyberg commanded the corps that was about to attack Heydrich's division. Under Heydrich were 3 regimental commanders. Oberst Karl Lothar Schultz held the town with Fallschirmjäger Regiment 1. Oberst Erich Walter held the hills beyond with Fallschirmjäger Regiment 4. The ground around the monastery belonged to Oberst Ludwig Sebastian Heilmann and Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3. Heilmann was 40 years old, born in Würzburg on August 9, 1903. He had enlisted in 1921, served 12 years, and left the Army in 1933 as a Feldwebel, a senior sergeant. He had come back into it as an officer. German parachute troops did not fight from buildings. Their doctrine was dispersal. Small positions sited apart from each other, dug in behind stone where direct fire could not reach them, each one able to hold on its own and to support the next. When a position was overrun, the answer was not to fall back and form a new line. The answer was to counterattack immediately before the attacker could consolidate what he had taken. An intact monastery offered such troops very little. It was a shelter. It was not a place to fight from, and they had not been fighting from it. Rubble was different. Broken masonry gave cover at every height and in every direction, in a pattern that no map recorded and no aerial photograph could read. It could be occupied in an hour. It could not be brought down a second time. On the morning of February 15, 1944, the bombers were sent to remove a building the defenders were not using. From a mountain they did not need it to hold. What the same tonnage would leave behind had been calculated by no one. The bombing did not open the road to Rome. It closed it. The bombing lasted through the morning. Accounts differ on how much was dropped. Figures of approximately 1,400 tons, 1,150 tons, and 453.5 tons all appear in the record, and the difference has never been settled. What is agreed is that only about 1/10 of the loads released by the heavy bombers came down on the Abbey itself. The rest fell on the mountain, on the slopes, on the valley, and in one case 16 bombs landed inside the 5th Army compound at Presenzano, some 17 miles away. General Fridolin von Senger and Ederlin had spent months keeping his men out of the building. He had reported to his superiors that field police watched the walls and that no German soldier had gone inside. When word reached him that the Abbey had been hit, his recorded reaction was 6 words: "The idiots, they've done it after all." That night, German paratroopers moved into the ruins. No Allied infantry attack followed the bombing that day. The mountain was hit, the smoke cleared, and for the rest of the 15th of February, nothing moved against it. The reason was that the Corps ordered to take the mountain was not ready to take it and had said so. Lieutenant General Sir Bernard Freyberg commanded the New Zealand Corps formed from the 2nd New Zealand Division and the 4th Indian Division and brought across Italy to replace the worn-out American divisions. He had told his superiors that he estimated the chances of the offensive at 50%. He was under pressure to attack quickly for a reason that had nothing to do with Cassino. The American landing at Anzio, Operation Shingle, had been contained and was in danger, and an attack at Cassino was expected to relieve it. The 4th Indian Division had the mountain. Major General Francis Tucker had commanded it, and Tucker had done the analytical work. Unable to get details of the Abbey's construction from 5th Army headquarters, he had found a book published in 1879 in a bookshop in Naples and used it to establish what the building was made of. Walls up to 150 feet high, masonry at least 10 feet thick. His conclusion was that field engineers could do nothing with such a structure, that if it was to be destroyed, it would take the heaviest bombs available, and that in any case the attack should not be made at Cassino at all. If it was made there, he argued, every German position on the massif should be attacked, point 593 above all, and the infantry should go in immediately behind the bombs. Eaker did not command the division on the 15th of February. He was in hospital at Caserta with a severe attack of recurrent rheumatoid arthritis, and he made his argument again from the bed. The division was under Brigadier Harry Demoline, its artillery commander, who was acting in his place. Major General Howard Kippenberger of the 2nd New Zealand Division had written down his own view of the building. Undamaged, he thought it a shelter and a poor fighting position, with narrow windows and level profiles. Smashed, he thought it would become a heap of broken masonry open to fire and a death trap if bombed again. On the whole, he concluded, it would be more useful to the Germans if it were left unbombed. Getting the Indian Division into position had proved harder than the Corps headquarters understood. There were no roads on the upper slopes. Ammunition, water, rations, and wire went up by mule, and men carried what the mules could not. Battalions had taken over their positions from the Americans 2 days earlier. In the valley, the ground was waterlogged, and the material for a full-scale assault had not come forward. Above all, the two halves of the operation were never joined. The air attack was planned by the Air Forces as a separate undertaking, timed against weather and the demands of other fronts, and it was not coordinated with the ground command. On the morning of the 15th of February, the brigade commanders of the 4th Indian Division were holding a planning meeting when the bombers passed over their heads. That was how they learned the attack had begun. On the afternoon of the 14th of February, Allied artillery had scattered leaflets over the summit carrying a printed warning in Italian and English. Leave the monastery. Leave it at once. Inside were the abbot, Gregorio Diamare, and his community. Diamare had been born Vito Diamare on the 13th of April, 1865, which made him 78, although some accounts give 79 and some 80. He had been abbot of Monte Cassino for 36 years. He was a small man, formal in manner, who had at first thought the idea of carrying the abbey's treasures away for safekeeping rather ridiculous. He and the monks went down into the deep vaults and survived. Approximately 230 Italian civilians who had come up the mountain for shelter did not. The first ground attack after the bombing went in that night against a hill 70 yards away. Point 593, which the Germans called Monte Calvario, sat on Snake's Head Ridge above and behind the abbey. It was the dominating point of the whole ridge, and it had been the position that stopped the American 34th Division. The bombing had not touched it. The ground around the monastery, Point 593 included, was held by Oberst Ludwig Heilmann and Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3. On the night of the 15th of February, one company of the 1st Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, moved the 70 yards from its own position on Snake's Head Ridge and attacked. It came back having lost approximately half its strength. The ridge was rock. There was no soil on it worth the name, and a man could not dig a hole to lie in. Positions on Snake's Head were built upward instead of downward, out of loose stone piled into low walls called sangars, which stood above the surface and could be seen. Everything that fell on that ground, shell or mortar bomb or bullet, broke against rock and threw splinters of it. Men were wounded by the mountain as well as by the ammunition. The following night, the Royal Sussex were ordered to attack again in battalion strength. Point 593 could not be shelled in support because the attacking troops were too close to it, so the fire plan called for the guns to hit Point 575, which had been supporting the defenders of Point 593. The shells fired at Point 575 had to pass very low over Snake's Head Ridge. Some of them came down among the companies as they were forming up for the assault. The battalion reorganized in the dark and went in at midnight. The fighting was close and much of it was hand-to-hand. The paratroopers held, and the Royal Sussex were driven off with over half their strength gone for the second night running. Across the 2 nights, the 1st Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, lost 12 of its 15 officers and 162 of its 313 men. Point 593 did not change hands. At 7:30 on the 17th of February, the surviving monks left the ruins. Diamare led them down the mule path toward the Leary Valley, reciting the rosary as he walked with the wounded carried among them. He afterwards signed a formal statement that no German troops had been inside the abbey. German radio then used him. Nothing in any of this was read at Allied headquarters as evidence that the method had failed. The bombing and the shelling had burned and blasted the vegetation off Monte Cassino. Stripped of cover, the hillside showed what had been built into it, a complex of dugouts and trenches running across the slopes. One report described the ground as showing extensive organization by the enemy. The positions had been there for months and had been invisible. Now they were visible, and their appearance was taken as confirmation that the target had been correctly identified, rather than as evidence that the target had never been the building. In Washington, the president held a press conference and said of the abbey that it was being used by the Germans to shell us. The conclusion drawn on the mountain was arithmetical. A company had failed, then a battalion had failed, against a position 70 yards away. What was needed was more. The plan for the night of the 17th of February divided the mountain among 3 battalions. The 4th 6th Rajputana Rifles would take Point 593 along Snake's Head Ridge, with the remains of the Royal Sussex behind them in reserve. The 1st 9th Gurkha Rifles would attack Point 444. The 1st 2nd Gurkha Rifles would go straight across the slopes and ravines at the monastery itself. 5 miles to the south, 2 companies of the 28th Maori Battalion would cross the Rapido in the dark and go for the railway station in Casino Town. The ground between the start lines and the objectives had been chosen by nobody. It was cut by gullies, sown with mines and wire, and the scrub in the ravines gave no cover because the defenders had prepared it. The Gurkhas were mountain troops, and the hope had been that mountain troops would find a way through terrain that had defeated everyone else. The fighting was close, and it produced nothing. The Rajputana Rifles lost 196 officers and men. The 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles, lost 149. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, lost 96. On February 18th, Demoulin and Freiberg called off the attacks on Monastery Hill. The other half of the attack came closer to breaking the line than anything the Allies attempted that winter. Captain Matarehua Wikiriwi, known as Monty, commanded B Company of the 28th Maori Battalion. He was 25, born on the 4th of April 1918 at Wakarewarewa of Tuhorangi, the youngest child of Erewera and Miriama Wikiriwi, and educated at Te Aute College. He had enlisted with C Company and been claimed for B Company as a Rotorua man. Taking the railway station would let engineers build a causeway forward so that armor could come up, and armor was the thing that had been missing from every attack on the river since January. 2 companies went in, A and B, about 200 men. The crossing was made in darkness under harassing fire. Flares went up over the water. Box mines exploded on the approaches. The banks beyond were laced with wire. Wikiriwi was wounded before he reached the station when a blast destroyed the wireless set he was carrying, and he went on. At the station, the fighting was rifle, bayonet, and hand-to-hand through the buildings and the rolling stock. Early in the night, B Company lost the whole of 10 platoon. A company was caught on the wrong side of a flooded stream. Joe Taware of Taupo was cut in half. They took the station and they held it through the following day, covered for much of it by a smoke screen that Allied artillery kept over the ground so the German observers on the mountain could not range on them. What they did not have was armor, or anti-tank guns, or any way of getting either forward. The engineers were building a bridge and had 1 span to go. The Germans did not expect to be able to remove them. In a conversation recorded between Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring and Generaloberst Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, the loss of the station is treated as serious, and the counterattack is not treated as certain to work. On the afternoon of the 18th of February, 2 German tanks came down on the station. That was enough. With the attacks in the mountains already broken off, the Maori companies were ordered back to the river. Of the 200 men who had crossed, 128 were killed, wounded, or captured. Wikiriwi's leg had been shattered by fire directed at the signal he had put up when the station was taken. His men covered him with a tarpaulin and left the shattered leg showing so the Germans would take him for dead, and on his own order they left him there when they withdrew. He came back alone over the following day and night. The battalion war diary of the 19th of February records how he propelled himself back with the aid of 2 pointed sticks. Command did not conclude that the offensive had been beaten by the defenders. It concluded that the offensive had been beaten by mud and by the absence of tanks. Both things were true, and neither was the reason. Every attack since January had failed at the same point, which was the moment when infantry that had reached its objective could not be reinforced or supported across ground the defenders still controlled. The answer adopted was not to change the shape of the attack. The answer adopted was to remove the ground. The third battle was given the name Operation Dickens, and its object was the town of Cassino, which the New Zealand Division would then clear in what Freyberg's plan described as a mopping-up operation. The town was already ruined, and its civilians were gone. It was held by approximately 300 paratroopers. For 21 consecutive days, the assault was postponed, while the troops waited in wet positions for 3 clear days of weather. During the wait, Kippenberger walked onto Mount Trocchio to look at the battlefield, stepped on an anti-personnel mine, and lost both feet. Brigadier Graham Parkinson took his division. The bombing began at 8:30 on 15 March and lasted 3.5 hours. Accounts of the weight vary between approximately 1,000 and 1,250 tons, delivered by something between 500 and 775 aircraft in relays over an area about 1,400 yards by 400. Behind it, 746 guns fired a creeping barrage against 300 men in a town that came to roughly 4 tons of bombs for every defender before the shells. The bombing was not concentrated. Only about half of it landed within a mile of the aiming point and about 8% within 1,000 yards. Of the paratroopers in the town, roughly half were killed, wounded, or buried alive. The rest fought, and the ground the bombers had made fought with them. Cassino had been a town of masonry buildings. What replaced it was a field of broken stone and craters, and the craters were the decisive fact. Tanks could not cross them. The armor that was meant to come through behind the infantry was stopped in the rubble at the entrances to the town and never got into it in strength. The rain returned that evening against the forecast. It filled the craters, turned the rubble into a morass, blotted out the moon, and drowned the radio sets, which could not survive constant immersion. Units in the town lost contact with each other and with the guns. The defenders reorganized faster than the timetable allowed for. New Zealand battalions took Castle Hill and Point 435 on the first day. A company of the 1/9th Gurkha Rifles, taking a track that avoided its intended objective, arrived on Point 435, Hangman's Hill, 250 yards from the monastery, and by the end of 17 March, the Gurkhas held it in battalion strength with their supply line cut by German positions behind them. On 19 March, the decisive stroke was to be a surprise attack by tanks that had come up the old logging track called Cavendish Road from Caira to Albanetta Farm, prepared by engineers working at night, and from there toward the Abbey. That morning, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division counterattacked off the Monastery Hill onto Castle Hill, which was the gateway to everything above it. The counterattack broke up the plan. The tanks went in without infantry, and by mid-afternoon, all of them had been knocked out. The fighting went on until the 23rd of March, when Alexander met his commanders and Freyberg said the attack could not continue. In the town, the gains had been measured house by house. In their time on the Cassino front, the 4th Indian Division lost 3,000 men, and the 2nd New Zealand Division lost 1,600. The clearest evidence of why the method kept failing was written by the Germans themselves, and it is not a boast. On the 23rd of March, the war diary of the 14th Panzer Corps recorded the strengths of the battalions holding the front line. They stood at between 40 and 120 men. Battalions at that strength are not units in any ordinary sense. They were the survivors of Ortona, of the February attacks, of 4 tons of bombs a man. They had no reserves worth the name, and they were not relieved. They held the ruins for 8 more days after the largest bombardment, yet directed at a single town. And the reason they held was not that they were unbroken. It was that broken ground defends itself, and that men trained to counterattack the moment a position is lost do not need to be numerous to make an attacker pay for every yard he takes. The bombers had not produced a defeated garrison. They had produced 40 men holding a heap of stone that no tank could enter. What followed was not fighting so much as endurance on both sides of a line that had stopped moving. The positions in the ruins were supplied at night by men carrying loads up tracks under observed fire. The Allied positions on the mountain were supplied the same way, by mule where mules could go and by hand where they could not. On the high ground, the dead could not be buried in rock, and the wounded came down slowly, or not at all. Singer had already tried to end it. At the height of the earlier fighting, he had, in his own words, mustered all the weight of his authority to request that the Battle of Cassino be broken off and a new line occupied further north. Kesselring refused. The Gustav Line would be held where it stood. One man went back up the mountain by choice. Carlomanno Pelagali was a monk of the abbey who returned alone to the ruins after the community had left. The paratroopers holding the position saw him moving among the broken stone and took him for a ghost. He was not seen after the 3rd of April. The material losses of the 4 battles can be counted, and the counting is disputed. One assessment puts Allied casualties across the Monte Cassino campaign at approximately 55,000 and German casualties at approximately 20,000 killed and wounded. Another, covering only Operation Diadem from May 11th, gives 43,746 Allied and 51,754 Axis. The Polish Second Corps lost 281 officers and 3,503 other ranks in May. Of the roughly 20,000 people who had lived in Cassino before the war, 2,026 were killed. The abbey, founded in 529, was gone. The loss that mattered most was not on any of those lists. Allied Air Command had believed that a sufficient weight of bombs could stand in for infantry, and that a position obliterated from the air could simply be walked into. Cassino did not weaken that belief. It ended it. Twice the method was applied at the largest scale then available, against a single hilltop, and then against a single small town. And twice the result was the opposite of the one predicted. The defenders were not removed, the ground was made harder to cross, and the attacking infantry inherited a fortress that had not existed before the bombers arrived. When the position was finally taken, it was taken by other means. Operation Diadem opened on May 11, 1944, with 1,060 guns on the 8th Army front and 600 on the 5th Army front, and no carpet bombing of the objective. 13 Allied divisions were assembled on a 20-mile front, while Kesselring, as late as the second day, still estimated 6. General Alphonse Juin's French Expeditionary Corps went into the Orunsi Mountains, and the Moroccan Goumiers crossed ground parallel to the Liri Valley that had been left undefended because it was not thought passable. The line was turned rather than flattened. On May 18th, a patrol of the 12th Podolian Uhlan Regiment reached the summit and raised a Polish flag over the ruins. The only defenders left were about 30 German wounded who could not be moved. The United States Army took 25 years to finish correcting its own record. In 1961, the Office of the Chief of Military History removed the assertion that German use of the abbey had been irrefutable. In 1964, answering a congressional inquiry, the same office stated that it appeared no German troops except a small military police detachment had been inside the abbey. The final change was made in 1969, and it read that the abbey was actually unoccupied by German troops. Abbot Gregorio Diamare did not live to see the abbey rebuilt. He died on September 6, 1945, of malaria, a little over 18 months after he walked down the mule path reciting the rosary. General Lieutenant Richard Heydrich was captured by American troops on May 2, 1945, and handed over to the British. He died in a hospital at Hamburg-Bergedorf on December 22, 1947, aged 51. Oberst Ludwig Sebastian Heilmann, who had held the ground around the monastery through all 3 battles, received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross on March 2, 1944, and the swords on May 15th, while the 4th battle was being prepared. He was taken prisoner in March 1945 and released in August 1947. He died at Kempten on October 26, 1959, aged 56. Captain Matarehua Wikiriwi survived the war. In 1958, he was among the founders of the Association of the 28th New Zealand Maori Battalion and was elected its first national president. He died on October 29, 1988, aged 70, and was buried in the soldiers' plot at Rotorua Cemetery on the other side of the world from the railway station where his men had left him under a tarpaulin. The abbey was rebuilt on its own foundations, to its own plan, and reconsecrated in 1964. The mountain that was stripped bare by bombing and shellfire has grown over again, and the terraces below the walls are green. The Polish War Cemetery lies closest to the abbey, on the slope the Poles climbed, and it is visible from the walls. The Commonwealth Cemetery holds British, New Zealand, Indian, Gurkha, Canadian, Australian, and South African dead on the western edge of the town. The German cemetery is about 2 miles north in the Rapido Valley. In the ground between them there is still metal, rusting where it fell. The paratroopers did not hold Monte Cassino because they had more men. They did not hold it because they had better weapons, or reserves, or air support, none of which they had. They held it because the bombing gave them ground that could not be crossed, and because they had been trained to fight from ground exactly like it. Monte Cassino was not taken by the heaviest bombardment of the Italian campaign. Monte Cassino was not taken by 4 tons of explosive for every defender in the town. Monte Cassino was taken in the end by men walking around it through mountains no one thought could be crossed. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. Stories like this survive only as long as people are willing to sit with the details, the disputed figures, the names, and the men on both sides of a mountain now buried within sight of each other. Leave a comment, and if there is a soldier or a unit in your own family's history you would like recorded properly, tell us.